So for the next couple of weeks, we are going to be going through the book of Ruth, just like we went through the book of 1 John. And Ruth is a book that's kind of close to my heart because when I was taking Hebrew in seminary, Ruth is the book we used to learn Hebrew with. It's a pretty straightforward little book, not too long, but not too short. And there's a lot of things going on with the book of Ruth that are interesting. And in large part, they're interesting because, well, of the history of the book of Ruth. And it's a history that we don't really talk about much because as far as where Ruth is in our Bible, it's sandwiched in between the book of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel, right? So when you put it there, yes, that's the time when the events were happening during the time of the Judges, but it's not really when the book was written. It was probably the last book written in what we call the Old Testament. It was almost certainly written after the people returned from the exile as a way to give the people hope and to solve a couple other issues. So we can easily convince ourselves that because of where it is in our Bible, that Ruth was written about the same time that the events were happening, but that's just not the case. The end of the book of Ruth, after all, is a genealogy that leads to David, and if it was written when it was happening, then how would they know about David and why he was important? But instead, in the Jewish Bible, the book of Ruth has an interesting place. It's in something called the 5 scrolls, and it's these 5, smaller books that are part of the same category as the Psalms. You might think, well, Ruth doesn't really look like the Psalms at all. Psalms are poetry, but Ruth is very much a story. But the function of the book of Ruth is not so much about the content and the events that are happening, but what it tells us about God. So among other things, you get this commentary about the need to be inclusive of foreigners, something that also becomes important in the New Testament as the early Jewish Christians ended up having to welcome Gentile Christians into the fold, and they didn't quite know what to do with it. The book also has a theme of the complications of what's called levirate marriage, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And of course, the last theme is probably my favorite, and I call it the theme of it just so happened. Because in the book of Ruth, a lot of things, as you're going along with the story, just happen. And the things that just happen are almost always very handy for Naomi and Ruth and really everybody. So the book of Ruth starts by setting a scene. And it's a really kind of funny scene because there's a famine in Bethlehem. And if you've ever wondered, Bethlehem literally means house of bread. There's a famine in the house of bread. But so there's this famine, and when there's a famine, you generally have to do something about it. So this guy named Elimelech decides that he is going to move, and he is going to leave Bethlehem, and he's going to go off to Moab, the neighboring country, because there's food in Moab. So he and his wife and their 2 sons go to Moab, and then he dies. Just that quick. You're like a couple verses in, and you're like, oh, well, that's no fun. Then the 2 sons, Mahlon and Kilion, they grow up, they get married, and then they also die. And so we're left with these 2 widows. Now, back in those days, of course, about the worst thing that a woman could be is a widow, because you just lost everything that was your support structure. Even worse if you're a childless widow, because then you don't have your sons to take care of you. Naomi had nothing, except for 2 daughters-in-law that she also had to try to figure out how to feed, because the 3 of them together wouldn't have a whole lot of resources to pull together. And so Naomi hears that the famine in Bethlehem is over and says, you know what, I'm just going to go home. At least if I'm going to be miserable, I'm going to be miserable at home. We can all relate to that, right? It's no fun if you have to be miserable away from home. But there's something nice about being miserable at home. You just feel a little bit better in your misery at home. So she starts to go home. Now they get about part way down the road, and Naomi has this realization. And she decides that she is going to send her daughters-in-law back home, to their home. And Naomi says, look, I'm not going to have more kids for you to marry. It's that whole levirate marriage thing. Even if I were to get married and have more kids, are you going to wait the 15 years until they're old enough? 13 years. 13 years until they're old enough to get married? Or are you just going to sit around until then? Go home, go back to your families, find new husbands, live your lives. One of the daughters-in-law, Orpah, is hesitant. Also, a little aside, Orpah and Oprah are very close together. Oprah was meant to be Orpah, but the letters got confused, and so we just a little bit of trivia about Oprah. So Orpah decides finally, after putting up a pretty good fight, that she is going to listen to Naomi and go back to her family and get on with her life. Ruth, on the other hand, doesn't want to leave. She does not want to leave Naomi behind, and she basically swears this extremely binding oath that she is going to be with Naomi forever. She is not going to leave Naomi. She is going to make sure that she's with Naomi the whole time. And finally, Naomi relents and they go back home. Now let's talk about this levirate marriage thing for a second, because it is a little bit confusing. And it sounds really weird to us today because it's a concept that we don't do. So here's how it works. If a man died without having a son, then the man's brother would be expected to marry his wife so that the dead man's line would continue. Now, I have to talk about this because it's really important in the book of Ruth. So the whole idea is, even though biologically the child is the brother's, legally the child is the dead man's, because it continues that family's line on through. It's a weird little system. It came up again in that weird, there's a bit where Jesus was confronted by some Sadducees, and they say, this woman married one guy, then he died, and then she married the brother, and he died, and she married the brother, and so on for 7 brothers. Who's she married to in the resurrection? That's that same concept. It comes up a couple times in the book of Genesis, but it's really not mentioned a lot, but it is a thing that happened. And because of the way the book of Ruth works, it's important. And I imagine you can see where this system got to be kind of problematic after a while. So Naomi and Ruth get back to Bethlehem, and everyone says, Naomi, you're home. It's so great to see you. And Naomi goes, no, it is not great to be seen. Everything is awful. God has been terrible to me. My life is atrocious. Stop calling me Naomi, which means pleasant. So stop calling me pleasant. Call me bitter. Naomi is a she is a curmudgeon, because she is her life has been terrible. She has to leave her home, her husband dies, her 2 sons die, and then she has to go back home, and she is just not happy about it. And so this chapter of Ruth just ends with miserable Naomi and faithful Ruth in Bethlehem, and you're left kind of wondering, how in the world are they going to support themselves? How in the world are they going to get food? How are they going to find a place to live? How is all this going to happen? So we get this last line that is just great. The barley harvest was beginning. Naomi is miserable, but she showed up in Bethlehem at just the right time. And that brings us, of course, to my favorite theme of the book of Ruth. It just so happened. Because over and over again in this book, things just happen. Coincidences keep happening so that Ruth and Naomi can get by. In the book of Esther, which was written around the same time, it also has similar themes. Did you know that God isn't mentioned in the book of Esther aside from in passing? And yet you can see what God is doing all through the book of Esther. It's the same way in the book of Ruth. God doesn't get mentioned all that often as taking actions aside from, kind of generic things like God caused there to be a famine and God caused there to be not a famine. But when they say that, that's more of an expression than actually ascribing the thing to God. And yet, as you go through the book of Ruth, all of these just so happens start to add up, and you can see the hand of God moving in Naomi and Ruth's life. Because it just so happens that it's barley harvest time. And it just so happens that they come across a rather well-off relative with a bit of an interesting heritage of his own. And it just so happens that a closer relative is a little bit too selfish. There's a lot of these things that just look like coincidences in the book of Ruth. And that's what probably makes me love Ruth so much, is because there are so many of these little things where if you're not looking for God, you won't see him. But if you are looking for God, the things that he's doing are obvious. And so as we go through the book of Ruth, we can see these things that just so happen, and we can start to look for those same things in our own lives. The little things that happen to us every day that when we're looking for God in them, his actions become obvious. Because at least in my life, that seems to be the way that God works most often. It's not in the big lightning bolt miracle moments that we hear about so often. It's in the little everyday things. So I got to tell you, do you remember a couple whiles ago when I told you about a plate that I was missing? So 8-plate set, we had 7 plates. Had no idea where this one plate was. And I had mentioned in a sermon that we had been praying for this, where this plate was, and couldn't find it. We were cleaning, opened the drawer underneath the oven, pulled out the drawer to get under there, and after being astonished at the level of dust bunnies that were there was the plate. Apparently, the dog had decided that she wanted the plate one day, got it off the counter, but it landed so that she couldn't lick anything off of it. And she just must have nudged it right under the oven. We found our plate. It's things like that, little things that frustrate you for so long, then all of a sudden, that can be a God moment. And so when we open our eyes and look for those little moments, when we look for God moving, we will see him. And we can take encouragement that God is involved. God does look at those little things in our lives. And he loves us enough to even find us a plate under the oven. And as we continue in the book of Ruth, let's look. Let us train ourselves to see those moments, to see God in the daily coincidences we encounter. Because then we can know that God is moving in our lives.